I want to take you to a story in Matthew chapter 14, a story that we probably know very well. And I don't anticipate that there's probably going to be any new thing that we're going to learn this morning, but hopefully we'll be able to put into practice what we already know concerning this awesome story as it relates to ministry. In Matthew chapter 14, starting in verse 13, it says, "Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he came ashore, he saw a great crowd and had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now when it was evening, his disciples came to him and said, 'This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves.' But Jesus said, 'They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat.' They said to him, 'We have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish.' And he said, 'Bring them here to me.' Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. And then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over, and those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children." Stop in verse 21. So, this is a story that's told in all 4 of the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all record this story. And when we take all 4 of those accounts, we learn several things. And I know it's so tempting to want to jump right into the story of the loaves and fishes. But I want to, just for a brief moment this afternoon, I want to take a look at this multitude that Jesus fed. Because this multitude is really a fascinating group of people. If you take the three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account, you find that as Jesus, it says in the beginning of this, "Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat." What we have is that Jesus has heard that his cousin, John the Baptist, is dead, and he's now retreating with the disciples. The disciples have come back from being sent out on mission from Jesus. They're coming back with all of these great stories of victory and accomplishment. So Jesus, now hearing that John the Baptist has died, and now hearing this testimony from the disciples, he decides he wants to just go and take the disciples off to a quiet place. But what happens when you read all of the accounts of the Gospels is that the people realize Jesus is going to this deserted place. And the Bible records that people saw him and saw the disciples in the boat, and they wanted to be where he was. And they wanted to be where he was so bad that they were willing to follow him on foot from all of the cities, the Bible tells us. So think about this for a moment and allow this to kind of play out in this mental motion picture in your mind to give you kind of an idea of why Jesus would bless these people so greatly. Because they know where he's at, and if we take all of these accounts, they are walking or running along the beach or the bank while they see him out in the water. Now, that's incredible, isn't it? And as they would go from town to town, people are like, "Where's everybody going?" And that they would have said something like, "Well, we're following Jesus." And when Jesus gets to the place and he opens and he comes out of the boat, do you remember? The Bible records that he was moved with compassion on them. Now, guys, this is an awesome part of the story. I love it. Because that multitude was willing to follow Jesus where there wasn't anything but Jesus. There was nothing else there. The disciples come back to Jesus and they say, "Master, the day is far spent, the night is at hand. This is a desolate place. Let's send these people away." Why were they there in the first place? They were there because of Jesus. They didn't care that there was anything else. They didn't care that there weren't trees. They didn't care that there wasn't shade. They didn't even care about food. Now think about that for a minute. When did we ever... They're obviously not Baptists. Obviously. I'm telling you what, if that line at lunch didn't move any faster, I don't know, I was about to lose my sanctification. I'm telling you, that was good food, but I was hungry like 2 hours before that. I couldn't have done this. I could not have done this. You know, it's funny, when you read this account in the New Testament, it is so refreshing, isn't it? Because that never would have happened in the Old Testament. You know that. They would have just left Egypt asking when the next meal was coming. They would have been so angry. And yet, this multitude has spent all day. They ran to be with Jesus out in a place where there wasn't anything but Jesus. No wonder when Jesus comes out of the boat and he sees them, he is moved with compassion and heals their diseases and teaches them of the kingdom of God. We talk about the people, we talk about the fact that Jesus multiplied the loaves and fish. But in my opinion, those people put themselves in a very blessable place, don't you think? To follow Jesus and to pursue him. But a problem arose. 5,000 men. Could have been 12,000, 14,000 people followed Jesus out to that place. Isn't that incredible? 14,000 people out there. 5,000 men, not counting women and children. So the disciples come to Jesus. Now this is important. As pastors, we have made a living picking apart the disciples. We're good at it. We're good at finding their flaws and preaching on them and making serious about it. We're good at it. But here's one time where they got it right. You see, that multitude is out there. Jesus has been healing them and teaching them. And then the disciples come to Jesus and they recognize the need of the people around them. They realize the people were hungry. The people weren't complaining about it. It was the disciples saying, these people have got to be hungry. Don't you love it when people in your church come to you as a pastor or ministry leader and say, man, I'm noticing some needs in my community. Don't you love that? I love that. I love it when they recognize an opportunity or an open door or a ministry that we can serve in the local church. And the disciples come to Jesus. But here's where it kind of gets a little wrong. Here's where the issue starts turning sour. When they come to Jesus, they say, we recognize these people have got to be hungry. But we want you to send them away. Now, in their defense, that was probably the best option. But you know what I think about sometimes in my life, in ministry? To me, those disciples came to Jesus with a plan and they wanted him to sign off on it. Yeah. You know, we got all these people out here, Jesus. We know they got to be hungry. Again, I don't fault them. I think it's awesome that they recognize the need. And I understand that probably was the best option for them in their minds without Jesus multiplying the loaves and fish. But they say, send them away. What does Jesus say? They don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. Now, that's big.
Amen.
12 to 14,000 people. And you know Jesus isn't joking. Everybody knows that. He has a totally different look on his face when he's joking with you. Here are the plans. Disciples say, send them away. Jesus says, do something about it. Now, is it starting to sound familiar maybe in our churches? There's a need. We want to send them away. Jesus says, do something about it. We're so willing and eager sometimes to dismiss an opportunity that we're willing to send them away. We got a plan. We got an idea. You know what? We'll send them down to the next church or the next area, or they'll find a way. They'll get around to it. Something will happen. Maybe God's not saying send them away. And by the looks of things with these people, these blessable people, no wonder he wouldn't send them away. They came caring more about him than anything else, including food. So most definitely he would give them food. I want you to see what Jesus does in this plan of his. When he says, he says they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. What does that cause them to do? It causes them to take an inventory of what they have. That's the first thing. When Jesus says, I'm not sending them away, you give them something to eat. Immediately they're reaching in their pockets, right? They're bringing out their satchels and looking. They're going around the people to say, what do you have? And to their credit, we know that they did find a boy who had a couple fish sandwiches that he brought to the party, and they confiscated. And they come back to Jesus. Now, let me just tell you something just for a moment. In Mark's account, in Mark chapter 6, Jesus says, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. This is where it gets difficult in ministry. Because we're going to find ourselves oftentimes in whatever area of ministry we're in. We're going to look out and we're going to see a need that is greater than our resources. We're going to look out and we're going to see that all of the needs around me are greater than what I have the ability to meet. I can't do it on my own. And you know, so often I've been tempted to say, God, if I just had a bigger budget, I could meet those needs. God, if I just had one more staff person, God, I could meet those needs. And you know what's funny? What's funny is I spent a lot of time in my life asking God to give me more so I could do the work. When all the while He was asking me to give it all so He could do the work. Amen. And that's what these disciples are seeing. Jesus says, you know, that you understand they're out there. You understand they're hungry. And Jesus says, I'm not going to send them away. You give them something to eat. So immediately they had to take an inventory. And let me let you in on the little dirty secret in ministry. Every one of us is in over our heads. Every one of us is. Isn't that funny? In ministry, in preaching circles, in all of our churches, isn't it funny that we can spend a fair amount of our time trying to prove to God, ourselves, and others that He got it right when He picked us in the first round? I mean, don't we? Don't we try to give off this impression oftentimes in ministry that we got it all under control? Trying to convince people. You know what? I'm going to be really honest. I feel like in the light of eternity, when I stand before God, I'm pretty sure that there's a chance that I was more of a liability to Christ's kingdom than an asset. He did not benefit greatly by having me on His team. And He turns to the disciples. How many loaves do you have? Go and see. I believe Jesus loves the local church. Yep. He died for the local church. He died for the believers. This is His body. And I believe He will withhold no good thing according to His will to bring about His plans through that local vehicle. Amen? And I know oftentimes in the ministry we're prone to say, God, I don't have what I need. He promised us that He would supply our need, didn't He? It's there. It's somewhere, isn't it? Go and see. It's going to require us to go back and take an inventory of what we have. And maybe we might have to invest in raising leaders or making disciples. Shucks, we might have to get back to what we were called to do originally in making disciples in order to accomplish what He called us to do. But when He says go back and see, it's important. When I look out and see all of the needs around me and I see how deficient I am in meeting those needs myself, I need to come back to Him and reveal my findings. That's where it gets tough. God, I don't have what it takes. You know what? Jesus didn't exactly bury that secret in the fine print of the Gospels. Never anywhere in there did He convince us that we were going to be sufficient for the job. Never. We shouldn't come to a place of insufficiency and then say, well, this wasn't part of the deal. Yeah, it was. The opening line of the best sermon ever preached begins like this. Blessed are the poor in spirit. The key to unlocking every one of the Beatitudes is understanding blessed are the poor in spirit. Apostle Paul said we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the power may be of the excellency of God and not of us. We don't have what it takes. We're all in over our heads, and that's the way it was intended to be. God does not want us to flex our muscle. He wants the world to be able to see His Son through us. It's not about what we can do. It's about what He wants to do through us. He goes to the disciples. I'm not going to tell them to go away. You give them something to eat. Well, this is all we have. This is it. We're so tempted to not want to continue. Jesus said, if anyone wants to be my disciple, let him deny himself. Take up his cross daily and follow me. He told the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. You know, there was a moment in Matthew, in chapter 17. The Bible tells us that Jesus left some of the disciples at the base of the mountain, and he took Peter, James, and John with him up on top of the mountain. When he got to the top of the mountain, he was transfigured before them. So Peter, James, and John saw this amazing image of this glorified Christ. They heard the voice of the Father. They saw Elijah and Moses. Amazing thing. And they come back down from the mountain, and there was a stir that had taken place. You see, while Jesus was gone, a man came to find Jesus because he had a son who had a demon. And the story says that the father says that the demon often casts my son into the fire and often into the water. And any of you that are parents, you know this father's anguish. He wanted his son healed, and he heard that Jesus could do it. So he comes to find Jesus. Oh, I'm sorry, Jesus is up on the mountain with Peter, James, and John, but can we help you? So the father gives his son to those that are 9. One after one, I believe, they tried to heal him and they couldn't. Father was disappointed. Jesus comes back down from the mountain. Jesus immediately heals the child, gives him back to his father. Do you remember what the disciples did after that? Oh, it's awesome. They see that Jesus healed that man, that boy. And they're walking back with Jesus. And it says when they came to a private place, they turned to Jesus and said, Master, why could we not cast him out? That's awesome. They recognized they were unable to do something. They recognized, they knew it could be done. They had done it before, but at that moment they realized they failed, and they were willing to ask the question, and they were willing to lay the blame on themselves. They weren't going to say the demon was too strong. They recognized the problem was with them. Jesus said it was their faith, or better yet, their lack of faith that they had. Oftentimes we don't want to look at ourselves. We want to blame others and look the other direction rather than saying, God, I'm insufficient. I don't have what it takes. What does Jesus say to do? When they come back with the inventory, small, not much, definitely not enough. What does he say? He says, give it to me, right? Give it to me. And what does Jesus do? He takes it and he blesses it. I would imagine he said something like this. Father, thank you for this food you provided today. He thanked God. Think about this. He thanked the Father for that little bitty amount of food that was never going to be enough in that state to meet the needs. You know what Jesus wants us to do? You know what the key to this is in ministry? Not how much I do, but it's about how much I let him do through me. You know what Jesus tells us to do? When we look out at our communities, we see more need than resources. He says, come here to me. You know what we do? We submit ourselves to him.
Amen.
We say, Jesus Christ, I don't have what it takes. My wisdom is not enough. Let me tell you something. My church, my community, and my family does not need some spit-shine, polished-up version of an old Jamie. My community, my church, and my family need Jesus. That's what they need. They don't need to see what I can do. They've seen that before. They don't need to see it again. What they need is Jesus. Bring him here to me. He blessed them. And then what did he do? Broke them. This past 8 months, I have gone through one of the most intense spiritual battles of my life. And I've come to learn that brokenness is not an event. It's a process.
Amen.
And that when we are broken, God builds us back. And when we are broken, God has the ability to use us in ways that we never were able to be used before. And when he calls those disciples to him and he says, what did you find? And they bring him the loaves and the fish. He says, give them to me. He gives them. He thanks God for it. And then he breaks it and begins to give it away. That is exactly what Jesus wants to do in my life and in your life. He wants us to willingly surrender and submit to his word and to his will and to his way. He wants us to come and say, there is no good thing in me. The only good thing is you. Amen. And I'm going to walk in obedience to you, and I'm going to submit to your will. I'm going to seek your direction, and I'm going to do what your word says. And in doing that, only by what you're able to do through me, you then are able to meet the needs in the most miraculous of ways that I could not apart. But it is blessing and breaking and giving back out. Vance Havner said, God uses broken things. Aren't you glad about that? Amen. God uses broken things. It takes broken soil to produce a crop. It takes broken clouds to give rain, broken seed to give a sprout, broken grain to give bread, and broken bread to give strength. God uses broken things as he distributes. And I want to tell you today, my hope is that every one of us will go back into our communities that we've been called, and that we will look with fresh eyes. I mean, we will look with fresh eyes. And that the Spirit of God may illuminate our eyes to see our community in a way we never have. And I pray that a result of that is that we may fall down at the feet of Jesus and say, Lord, I don't have what it takes. If there were 5 of me, friends, none of us are enough. You could take all of your nuffs and give them to me and I still wouldn't have enough. We're all deficient. But we don't often want to admit it. I want to ask you today, what's the outcome? The people's needs were met. And Jesus was glorified. We all come in here. And we're all in here because we want to learn. We want to be able to go back and impact our community in a powerful way for the name of Jesus. And I want to stress this one more time. Every one of us is some degree in over our head. It is so tempting in the ministry to want to splash around in the shallow ends, isn't it? But Jesus calls us out to the deep end where we cannot see the bottom nor touch. He doesn't lead us out to the deep end of our faith to drown us. He leads us out to the deep end of our faith to perfect us. And for you and I, we don't have what it takes. We're going to wallow in that. We're going to give up. We're going to throw our hands up. Or we're going to do what Jesus asked us to do with the bread and the fish. We're going to willingly give ourselves to Jesus. Say, God, I want to recommit, rededicate my life to your cause. I want to surrender to your will. God, I want to do what you're calling me to do. I want to see you glorified and honored in my life, in my community. Feel free, God, to break me.